Um, not, oh, I haven't heard from Councillor Hightower.
She's joining. I just promoted her now.
Okay. Hello.
Hello, hello.
So I think we've got everybody at least up for the first part of this meeting. So I think we will get started. So it is, can you remember what day it is here? March 17th. Oh my goodness, back to St. Patrick's Day. Councillor McGee, are you of Irish descent? I might guess, but
Yes.
okay, well, those who celebrate, happy St. Patrick's Day. It's the Community Development and Revitalization Committee meeting on March 17th, and we're starting at 5:05. Sarah Carpenter, chair, and we will begin. I want to propose some amendments to the agenda, and would take a motion to that effect. One would be to drop, or we're going to postpone the discussion on the tax policy research. And then I would propose moving the public forum until after the CEDO emergency shelter pod project update. You'll note that the ARP home public hearing would follow that. That actually has technically its own public comment process. But since the agenda is combining several issues around houseless issues, I thought we would get all of the updates first, and then we could hear from the folks that are here to comment on that. I'm not expecting that this committee will make any specific or substantive recommendations on the issues tonight. So therefore, I thought it might be useful for everyone to hear the conversation, the updates before public comment, and then they can comment on that if they would so choose. Is that okay with folks? So if someone would like to move those changes, which is postponing the tax policy discussion and moving public forum to after item 7.
Okay. I could make a motion to postpone item number 6, have item number 7 become item number 5, and item number 5 become item number 6. Does that work?
That sounds accurate.
Okay.
Thank you.
Second.
All in favor of that?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay. I would take a motion to approve the minutes of the February 17th meeting.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. So our next item is we've invited, and I appreciate her coming. We've invited Assistant City Manager Cameron Niedermeyer from Montpelier. And as most of you know, or many of you know, the City of Montpelier has wrestled with some of these issues. They spent a chunk of last year working on them, and I believe adopted a policy this last end of summer or fall. And so what I thought would be, and I understand that Councilor McGee has looked at the policy and had conversations with a number of folks in Montpelier about it. So what I thought we'd ask is Cameron to sort of talk about the process, how they worked through the process, got to where they are with the policy they've got, and then any comments she's got about what worked well, what's not working so well, and we'll maybe just sort of start there. We do have a couple of invited guests as well. Morgan Brown, who is from the Montpelier area and has been an advocate with Council Folk, is with us. Joe, who else is joining us? Kind of issue.
Ken Russell is supposed to be joining us. I'll reach out to make sure he's still available.
Okay.
And Paul Dragon, I think, is here in the attendee room.
Okay.
I'm trying to
Sarah?
promote him, but I cannot get him promoted. So I will keep
Okay.
trying. So Paul, if there's any issue on your end, if you could just let me know, but I am trying to promote you to a panelist.
Sarah, I had an accommodation request.
Sure.
I just would like to ask anybody who's speaking and participating that you speak in plain English and don't use acronyms if you can help it, because they're lost on me and I end up getting distracted and not being able to follow the conversation.
Okay, that's
Thank
fair.
you.
No acronyms. We've just got to remember what the acronyms stand for. That sometimes is a problem. Okay, so Cameron, maybe you can kind of talk again about what precipitated this with Montpelier, your approach to it, what's been working, what's not been.
Thank you. So I appreciate it, council member and committee members. Thank you for having me here today. I am Cameron Niedermeyer. I am the assistant city manager in the city of Montpelier, joining you from my lovely basement today. So I wanted to talk about the encampment policies. I know that's what you're interested in. I'm going to start by sort of talking about what isn't working and why more discussion is needed. And so this is a very encouraging conversation that y'all are having. So we have an encampment policy, which basically follows some larger court case guidance in the United States that allows folks, and I guess that may be the wrong word, but gives folks the grace to and an opportunity to camp in an emergency need on publicly owned land if they're not causing damage to that publicly owned land, right? That is stopgate. Yes, ma'am.
I don't mean to interrupt you. I just want to point out that Attorney Dan Richardson, who's now our city attorney, actually did some of the work on this when he was engaged with Montpelier. We're on a little slower track, and for the audience as well, we have asked the city attorney's office to do a legal review of all of the issues, including the issue you're talking about in terms of camping bans and federal law issues, as well as a review that we currently have proposed and yours. So I just want to make sure, so we're kind of a little ahead of our game. That review will come to us in mid-April. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, that does add some context to this conversation. So we as I say staff, you're right. At the time, City Council member Dan Richardson helped us with this. Really, the goal would be to take a general non-involvement approach to any found emergency sleeping campsites. So I think I'd like to talk a bit about what doesn't work. And I think what needs to be acknowledged is that no one should be sleeping outside, that this is emergency provision so that folks who do need to sleep emergency outside for any given reason aren't being harassed for that, right? That's really the goal. And so the policy's point is to highlight the expectations on both staff side and folks who are camping. So, and when I say camping, I really do mean emergency sleeping. It's not a family of 5 going for a fun trip in our camp or our parks. It's people who have emergent need, who need a place to sleep, who don't have a place to sleep. So just so that we're all sort of talking about the same thing on that, it's not about fun time camping, it's about emergency sleeping. So that is what I would say is not working, is that there is need for people to be sleeping outdoors. What is next steps for us and what we need to sort of wrestle with as communities and cities is, where are those permanent shelters and what are we doing to increase the number of beds available in our communities? So when it comes to the policy and how we went through the steps, we have a really strong homelessness task force in Montpelier. who really brought this to our attention is that there are people who are sleeping outdoors in an emergent need. How do we address that as staff, and how do we address that as community? We did not have a centralized staff policy on how folks were supposed to engage with people they found camping or sleeping in our properties. So how do we engage with folks, and what are the expectations that I have for staff in their interactions with people who are sleeping unhoused in our property? So we sort of outlined what would be the way to handle this with the most grace and the most respect, I think, was a big issue for us. We want to make sure that people knew what their expectations was of the space and what their expectations should be of staff. And so really it kind of came down to just being as non-interventionist as possible, except if in certain circumstances somebody was damaging or causing a mess, or a couple different reasons outlined in the policy. So we worked very closely with our homelessness task force, with Dan acting on behalf of the city council. And we worked very closely with our Parks Commission, who is their own independent elected body, who sort of is our parks caretakers. So they had quite a bit to say about how public land, most of it in Montpelier, is park land. I think we have very few spaces that are public that are not parks, and they're mostly cemeteries. So just trying to take the needs of all of these stakeholders in mind, creating this policy. So hopefully that walks you through sort of how we got to where we are now. There was quite an iterative process. A lot of folks had feedback. We had multiple council meetings where this was discussed, multiple Parks Commission meetings where this was discussed. Since its passing, which was in September 2021, we've kept pretty close track on implementation, and if people have run into more folks emergency camping in our parks, and that is not something we have seen as an outcome of this. But I would say, just colloquially, that's probably because of the hotel motel program that the state started. Most folks have been able to be housed through that, and so there has been less need for emergency camping in that sort of time frame. So a lot of interesting things were converging at the same time. So that was a whole lot of talking. If anyone has any questions or want to just break in, that would be great.
I have one question, and I also see Councilor-elect Ben Travers here, who happens to be chair of our Park Commission, so we might want to promote him. But in terms of where issues were coming up, I'm not as familiar with park system in the Montpelier area, so I can't comment. If you could comment on kind of Pope Park system. We, as I'm sure you've been to Burlington and know, we have some very active parks, North Beach and Letty Beach and City Hall Park, as opposed to woods, and which we have as well. We have 22 parks or something like that. So there's quite a diversity of the type of park. Is that true in Montpelier? Is that a
No, I would say that's not necessarily true in Montpelier. Where we've seen people emergency camp is in the woods. We have quite a bit of wooded parks. Most of our parks are hiking trails, biking trails through the woods. So basically what we're talking about is wooded areas or swampy areas. That kind of thing is what our parks are. They're less of, I think, the type of park that you have in Burlington.
So maybe for the edification of all of us, your park policy, I think, is attached, or at least it's on our website. But we have a lot of interesting folks here. You could sort of explain the process and how you approach it.
I'm sorry. So if there is, okay, so you're asking me to walk through what the policy says?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have quite a few lists, basically, of what we would consider a high sensitivity area. So if you're found camping in a high sensitivity area, you would be asked to leave that space, not necessarily public space, but that high sensitivity area within a certain time frame. So the list is pretty long. In the chat, I can put a link to our policy if people are interested. So I'll do that now.
Christine, is that posted on our website?
Let me just double check that. Yes, it is up on the CDNR website as well.
Okay, thank you.
So we have quite a few things that would make something a high sensitivity area. A couple different that our city staff would use to determine if someone is asked to move from that space. In general, they can be sort of set as public health factors, like if somebody is creating excessive waste or grounds that are tied to public health, sort of like our water treatment plant or our water resource recovery facility, or someplace that would be likely to interfere with public health or operations of a facility. Public safety factors, so if they're near a school, adult daycare facilities, or other public facilities that serve young or vulnerable populations, privately owned land, or easements. So there's quite a few sort of boundaries that we've put around spaces that are inappropriate for emergency sleeping. And then also some environmental protection factors, which are really important for our Parks Commission, included being having an encampment located in an area that's protected or deemed sensitive by our local laws. They use wetlands and vernal pools as examples. So we have quite a few of those throughout our parkland. So basically the policy states any designation such as the high sensitivity area or action taken under the policy is not intended to penalize an individual found at camping under emergency circumstances. Rather, it is to prioritize the removal and relocation in recognition of public health, public safety, or environmental protection issues. So basically, if somebody is found or if an emergency campsite is found in a high sensitivity area, our staff would first basically just report to leadership and to public safety where that person is, so that we can work with our peer support outreach professional, which is a very important part of this policy. The city of Montpelier has a few folks that we're paying to be peer support outreach workers, which are basically folks who have lived experience or experience of homelessness that can go and help us reach folks who are experiencing homelessness now and connect them to resources and services. So the idea would be to get our peer support outreach worker to help us connect them to actual services, and making sure that our public safety personnel knows where they are in case of an emergency. So if they have emergency, we help them. So we would then, if we know where somebody is and they're in a high sensitivity area, we would notify our peer support outreach worker, and then work with that person, work with our peer support outreach worker and our city manager's office to address that person specifically and ask them to locate or help connect them to services. It's a pretty long policy because we wanted to make sure it protected both the rights of the person who was camping and the safety of our staff. So I don't want to read it to you, but basically the biggest intervention we have is asking people to relocate and or connecting them to services.
Can you speak?
Does that answer your question? I'm sorry. I feel like I am.
No. The timing of that. I mean, how much time do you give somebody to relocate?
Yes. Hold on just a second. Except when urgent health and safety concerns require shorter notice, encampment residents will be given 24 hours to relocate or to accept an offer of shelter or alternate housing.
Okay, 24 hours.
Yes,
And if they choose not to accept an alternate location or alternate,
we're hoping it doesn't get to that point, but at a certain point, if you are asked to relocate and you don't, you could be cited for trespassing on public property.
Has that been an occurrence?
That has not been needed, no.
I'm going to just ask one more question, and then I wanted to open it up to the panelists at least for questions. You mentioned the issue of needing, I'm just going to call it longer term camping. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Can you say it one more time? I'm sorry,
Well,
your
I thought
connection.
you mentioned that there was a sort of an issue with needing, and I just said longer term camping, but some alternate. Did I misunderstand you?
Well, yes, I'm sorry. What I'm trying to say is that no one should need to camp.
Oh.
What we all should focus on is finding real locations and safe locations for people to sleep indoors.
Okay, thank you. Councilor McGee, you had a question? And I'm going to open this now to committee members and Councilor-elect. They'd like a question.
I'm curious, excuse me, the 24-hour time period was there a extensive conversation around that, or could you kind of speak to how you landed on that time frame for removal?
Yes, so that is one of the bigger issues of this. But our thought process is if we're asking someone to relocate, it's for a reason. It's not a spurious decision. It's because of health and public safety reasons or environmental concerns. And so we would ask folks to relocate to a place that would be safer for them and safer for our community. Because mostly it's worry about you're too close to something that could potentially get you in trouble or cause harm, and that's not what the policy is for. If you look on the sort of last pages, and Morgan was very involved in this one as well, is we have a longer time period for encampments that we come across, which is actually a bigger issue for us that are abandoned, and what we do with that property. And that is something that has a much longer turnaround time. We hold on to that. We try to give as much notice as possible, try to connect with the owner of that so that there's no confusion and there's no throwing away someone's belongings. So there's a couple different time frames involved in this policy.
Other councilors or councilor-elects, do you have any questions?
Sure.
Councilor Bergman, Councilor.
So, Cameron, I'm going to try to switch back and forth between your policy and the screen here. I'm noticing there's a real distinction that you've got between locations and then these general public safety considerations. So the locations are very clear. You can't be 50 feet from something, and you've got that down. But you've got these other public safety considerations. So I'm wondering how you all are working through that, whether you're trying to get people to remediate the problems, whether the city is helping, say there's sanitation problems with providing trash removal facilities, or if there was there's other facilities like a porta potty or what have you.
So our parks all have restrooms available. I'm thinking through our Hubbard Park, which is our largest internal park to the city, has public restrooms inside of it that are 24/7. We do have trash cans that are actively monitored and cleaned at the beginning of all of our parks and throughout Hubbard Park. So no, I can't say we're proactively taking care of that because we're not, but if somebody had asked, hey, I need a trash can or I need X, that's not something that's out of the realm of possibility.
So, like you've got a criteria for excessive waste.
Yes.
Your official comes and finds there's excessive waste. What do they do?
Well, I mean, I think the outline is pretty clear in the policy. So I won't read that to you, but it's really asking someone to, I can't really say carte blanche, we would do X. I think because the type of population that we would be dealing with in this doesn't have a carte blanche answer. If someone is having excessive waste because of reasons of X, I'm going to use an example of somebody we asked to relocate because they had 20 chickens traveling with them. And they were causing excessive waste because there was 20 chickens traveling with them, right? So the help and the mitigation tools and tactics from there can be captured in this policy, but we were trying to help them find places for their 20 chickens, right? That timeline of 24 hours was extended in that case because we didn't want that person to not know what happened to their chickens, right? So, and that ended fine because we found a collective place where everyone was happy where those chickens could go, right? So I think right now it's a small enough population where it's a case-by-case basis out if it's required to be something outside of the policy. That's all I think is a fair way to answer that.
Okay, thanks.
We have one question about from one of the audience about typically your parks have closure times, and also again this is sort of trying to get a hand on your parks because do they abut dense residential neighborhoods? I mean, at some level they must, but is it more spread out as opposed to
Yes, when you
more
picture
urban parks, I guess?
Yes, they are not urban parks. We have exactly one urban park, really, if you consider it that. We have, our parks are very large, hundreds and hundreds of acres of woods with walking trails through them. So there's quite a lot of empty wooded areas that don't have trails through them, and that is still part of our park system. So when we're talking about our park system, y'all got to picture woods, just straight up woods. That's what our parks are like. Yes. It's huge. So I see questions in here. Hubbard Park does close. We have, and it's someone is asking how do we police such a huge area? I would say it's a community effort. We have just a lot of trust in our residents and our community. We do patrol the space, not all of it all the time. We have a very small parks department. There are 5 of them, I think, off the top of my head. I don't know how to answer that question, really, to be honest with you.
We can circle back around to Cameron if she can continue with us for a few more minutes. We have Morgan Brown with us and Ken Russell. And I know they're active in the houseless community in Montpelier. So maybe if Morgan, maybe you want to start and just offer a few words about how the policy is working from your perspective and any other thoughts you have, and maybe Ken could do the same thing. And please introduce yourself.
Morgan Brown, Montpelier. I'd prefer Ken to go first.
All right, Ken.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here. My name is Ken Russell. I'm the chair of the Montpelier Homelessness Task Force and the executive director of Another Way, which is a community drop-in center in Montpelier. And I'm, we reviewed Cameron's good work on the camping policy and then further by the city council with a lot of good, robust input. And I'm not going to get down into the weeds of, the details of it, but I do think that as a statement for the community, it was a pretty important move. Just saying people are allowed to be here. They're allowed to exist in our jurisdiction. If you go back and read the Ninth Circuit ruling about the Boise, Idaho situation, which was sort of the basis of a lot of this work, it was very narrow.
But in the process, but it was basically laid out that people have a right to exist. They have a right to sleep in a jurisdiction. And I feel that a lot of the importance of the policy in our town was sort of a moral statement on the part of the community. And I think it draws on the best traditions of New England communities. I grew up in Vermont town, Brandon, down Route 7 from y'all. And I feel that, you know, it's a community value where we do consider everyone's needs. It's you know, and that doesn't mean we don't hold people accountable for their behavior. But it does mean that, like, these people live here. How are they going to exist? If they're intense right now, that's something. But it also highlights that we have a lot of work to do in our built environment to provide housing for everyone. I just want to mention the waste, the excessive waste. I mean, we just had, and Cameron had mentioned sort of the community response. We have members of the unhoused community very actively picking up some of the worst spots with the trash right now, and you'll hear from a lot of them. You know, like, these other folks are giving us a bad name. There's a strong ethos of taking care of things, but then it's frustrating because there's so much spillover from some of the bad behavior. So, but what I see, and maybe I'm an optimist on human nature. I see people really caring about where they are, taking care of each other, and that we have to figure out if we really want to be progressive, small p progressive in how we create our communities. We have to figure out how to all fit together without turning into gated communities and nothing but white picket fences. And so I'm glad you all are taking this on, and those are my remarks today.
Thank you. Morgan, did you want to add?
If somebody wants to ask me a specific question, that would be fine, but I apologize, but I wasn't able to have enough time and energy to prepare as much as I had hoped. So it would help me if somebody wants to ask a question.
Okay. Councilor-elect Travers had several questions, and I know he's juggling childcare there, but I'll let him ask his questions. And I want to make sure that people understand, even though this seems like we've sort of leaped ahead, we had said we will be going much more broadly back to Burlington, but because of all of the commitments of our city councils committees, we are waiting for some review from the city attorney. And so we really just want to familiarize ourselves with the Montpelier policy, which is a step ahead of ours. We have a policy, we've adopted a policy, but I think there's some acknowledgement we need to update that policy. So I just want to make sure, and I'm saying that more for the benefit of the audience. Councilor-elect Travers, who, as I said, also is chair of our park commission, and I guess will be for the rest of the month until his new job takes over, had several questions. So are you okay to ask them, Ben?
I'm okay. We'll see if
Yeah.
Zoe cooperates here. So
Okay.
thank you for having me. It's nice to be here, Cameron. I appreciate your being here, and I know that I was connecting with you via email and appreciate your responsiveness there. And glad to connect here. We did host a discussion with this, and thank you to Councillor McGee and Councillor-elect Bergman for being to the Parks Commission to go over this initially. And we had a number of public comments there, and I would say, in large part, the comments are folks who are wanting to do what we can as a community to provide grace, as you put it. I think that's a good word, and to assist our neighbors who are experiencing houselessness. On the other side of that, there are folks expressing concern, right, about those people as well who are using parks. And I think that you draw an important distinction between the parks in Montpelier and the parks in Burlington, that the parks in Montpelier being more largely wooded areas and parks in Burlington being on the whole more urban parks with ball fields and playgrounds and soccer fields and so on and so forth. So I guess a couple of the questions that I have, and I'm sorry if you touched on this already, but one of them is that does the Montpelier policy allow for the construction of structures like a lean-to or another structure? No, I see you shaking your head. No.
No. I don't think it actually, I'm not sure if it 100%
I don't believe
addresses
it.
that. I'm
I did
just
not
trying
read
to
that.
skim through it real quick. I don't, because the issue is that, we talked about that a bit with our fire chief, who's our code enforcement sort of staff as well, and that it just isn't appropriate. That could be very dangerous for folks to build their own structure. It's a large fire hazard. I'm not sure if it addresses that necessarily within the policy, but that would be something that we wouldn't be all right with.
Thanks for that. Another follow-up question is, are you able to speak to at all how you settled on 24 hours? I suspect that one of the discussions we're going to be having here is to what that timeline should be. The proposal here, it has a 30-day window. Yours is 24 hours. Can you talk to why you settled on 24 hours, and did you consider a longer period than that?
We did. So there's two parts of our policy. I'll address the 24 hours first. The 24 hours came out of the need to address the fact that if we're asking someone to move because of public safety or personal safety or environmental safety concerns, and there's a reason we're asking folks to move. It's not move along, it's you cannot be in this area for X reasons. So we're gonna have to ask you to leave this one area, not Montpelier, not the not the park in general, just this one space. And so the idea is the only reason people are being asked to move is because they're impacting something, right? So that 24 hours becomes important because we don't want there to be further damage if there's damage, or if that person is in an area that's dangerous to them, such as a wetland or some of the areas that we have that could be really prone to, a lot of Montpelier is prone to flooding, especially as we enter into mud season. Things can flash flood immediately. If somebody is, we address that in our policy as well. If you're someplace that could be a danger to you, we want you to not be there because we're worried about you as well. So the 24 hours is important for that piece. We do have another part of this policy that outlines a longer response period. So if staff comes across an unintended camp or an emergency campsite that looks abandoned or something, we don't want to take that property because it's not ours to take. So there's a warning notice and trying to find someone to try to connect people back to their belongings. So that's a longer time period. And that will be, I think, something very important to consider as a council, is a longer time period for the belongings, not necessarily, and to think that through how, if you're asking someone to move quickly out of a location, what do you do with the things that can go with that person, right? So making sure you have a really good policy that addresses what happens to people's things so that they don't get damaged, or if they can't go with somebody and it's not hospitable where they are, how do you make sure that their belongings are safe so that they can get somewhere hospitable to themselves, So that is a pretty important part of our policy. I also want to point out that part of our policy really sort of tries to highlight the need for peer support to be there with us. So we would not ask someone to relocate that quickly without bringing resources and help to that person. So that's also a very important part of the policy. Hopefully that answers your questions.
Can you speak a little bit more about the peer support people, specifically who they are and how you contract with them?
Yes. So thank you for asking. We have we're expanding the program. So right now we have, as far as I understand it, the equivalent of one full-time peer support outreach worker who is contracted through Good Samaritan Haven, who is a service provider in Montpelier. and in the surrounding towns. So we contract with them to provide a peer support outreach worker who can help, who is constantly helping folks experiencing homelessness in our community. Oh, and if we have a specific need as the city, we call them and ask them for assistance.
I just had one other question from the Parks Commission, Councilor Carpenter, if
Yes.
I could. Okay. So Cameron, imitation is the best form of flattery, they say. And as you know, the proposal here is largely based off of the policy that you put together, including the fact that some of the criteria that's put in there talks about how what would make an encampment highly sensitive would be it's being in a location that's protected from development, like in a wetland, a vernal pool, or steep slope, or in a designated wildlife habitat area. And I'm curious whether those terms have a particular meaning there in Montpelier. I mean, given that so many of your parks are wooded areas, is that do those segments put a sizable acreage of your parks off limits with respect to encampments because they are designated as wildlife habitat areas, or what's being referred to there with those provisions is the question, I guess.
Fair enough. It doesn't limit a huge amount of our parks, and it wouldn't be up to somebody to determine that. It would be up to our staff to help if they notice somebody emergency camping in one of those protected areas. It would be up to staff to let them know that. But I don't think it's a huge area. Again, yes, all of those things make, I'm trying to parse your question here. Yes, all of those things are located in our parks. We have vernal pools, we have wetlands, we have really steep crag slopes that are dangerous to people, which would be why we would be worried about that. And we do have some areas that are wildlife habitat areas that our Parks Commission asked us to make sure are protected under this if we need to ask someone to relocate, and that would be why. But it doesn't, I don't have the acreage numbers, but it's not a huge amount of time.
Yeah, I was mainly curious about, like, for example, I didn't know, is Hubbard Park in entirety, a wildlife habitat area, and is that basically what it's referring to there? You've answered my question. Thanks.
Okay.
Counselor Carpenter, we can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay. I do see in the question several questions about camping in Burlington. And just to step back 1 minute, and others can clarify, but we are approaching this as potential changes to how we may do business. Currently in Burlington, there is no camping allowed in any of the parks. So I just want to make sure we understand that. But we have a very varied park system. Councilor McGee's proposal is to amend that in some way. And that's what we're beginning to discuss. There have been no decisions at this point about where or where not in camping would be allowed. So I just want to make sure everybody understands there's been no decisions around that. That's the point of this process that we're beginning, is to discuss that. Do we change the current ordinance in any fashion? Councilor McGee and Councilor Bergman have made a proposal, and that's what we're beginning to act on or examine. So I just want to make sure the audience understands there's been no decisions. We have no camping in parks, and we have a response policy that was actually in practice adopted several years ago through a negotiation with a number of participants. It was never formally adopted by the city council until actually about a month ago. So we have two pieces of guidance right now in our city and ordinance, and a policy, and that's what we're beginning to talk about. One of the differences that I think is different than Montpelier is kind of the so-called other public land that is not a quote park, but that the city owns. And that is a gray area, I guess you would say. That in fact is what the Sears Lane encampment, that was on quote other city land. And that has not been clearly dealt with other than the response policy that was adopted by the council. And I'm really adding that as clarification. At this point in time, we will try to have some targeted discussion on each of those. So councilors or counselor, are there other questions for Cameron?
Yeah, can I wonder if, Morgan, if you could speak to the concerns that you've shared about storage and the time requirements for that.
Okay, so my name is Morgan Brown. I reside in Montpelier. And I'm a person who has previously lived unhoused, also known as homeless, for quite a bit of my adult life. The last go around was 12 years, and that was about 12 and a half years ago. I've been permanently housed since. First, I just want to state that I want to check my volume here. Can people hear me all right? Okay, thank you. I want to state that I'm only speaking for myself, no one else. Everybody's experience is different. No one else speaks for everybody else. And I also want to say that as you progress in working on this, if you haven't already done so, and I'm speaking to the committee and those involved, it's imperative that you seek out and hear from people with lived experience, those who currently live in unhoused, and those that formerly have done so up in the Burlington area as well. And thank you for inviting me to speak. So to try to answer the question, before the storage time frame was 30 days. And in fact, if you read carefully through the policy, it didn't get corrected as I thought it was supposed to be. And there's two different things. One says 30 days and then further on it says 90. And it's supposed to be 90 as I understand it from Dan Richardson, but apparently it didn't get, so there's an inconsistency there, but it's supposed to be 90 days. And I wish it was. You know, people can not be around, you know, so they can end up in jail or the hospital or staying with somebody, and they might not get back to the camp and stuff, and or to this, be able to try to get this stuff if it's being stored. And, you know, we're not talking about just tents and blankets and clothes and the like. We're talking about other things, including memorabilia, which can be really important to people, photos, other things that are important to someone personally, and also documents. You know, a lot of times if a person might have documents and they can get thrown out or whatever, or say they get stored. Well, if they're not able to get, you know, get in contact and get access within the 30 days, they lose their documents. It's almost impossible. It's hard at the very least, but it's almost impossible to try to get new documents, you know, if you're lucky to, you know, retain them. And you know, there's all kinds of things like that that people don't always think about, you know, and they take for granted. And, you know, these items, you know, that might be trash to some folks are treasures to others, you know, and they're important and they shouldn't just be discarded, you know, and there's instances, at least one I know of, where, you know, the Parks Department came across a person's camp and the person showed up with their, you know, removing the stuff. And long story short, stuff ended up in the trash, you know, and the person was offered new stuff, but they were so traumatized with stuff, they didn't want nothing to do with the city. Who can blame them, you know? And so, you know, it's very important to really honor a person's dignity and you know, to show respect for the person and what little they might have. You know, and this is something I have actually written about in the past. And, you know, a lot of times you don't have a lot, you know, and you lose stuff very easily and you don't need any help in that department. So somebody comes along and trashes your stuff, you know, think about that, you know, and, you know, a person shouldn't lose their rights just because they don't have, you know, the kind of housing that, you know, we might take for granted. And we need to, you know, honor that. And I think it's important to have a policy in place. And I think the one that has been drafted is a good one. And I'm pleased with the 90 days thing. And I'm pleased that there isn't a punitive thing where people will be fined, you know, that, you know, think about it. If for whatever reason, if a person's in a restricted place, that their camp is, you know, removed, you know, that's punitive enough. You know, if you go find them, you know, what if they can't afford it, or what if they decline to pay it? Well, where do you go there? You know, it's like, don't go there, you know, and I'm glad that the policy doesn't have, you know, fines and stuff. And, you know, there's a better approach, and I think that this policy goes a long ways to do that. And thank you again for inviting me. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. I noticed we haven't promoted CEDO Director Pine, which we should have, and I'm not sure if he's got any questions as well. So maybe we want to promote him. And I also maybe wanted to shift a little bit and ask Cameron, and we have Paul Dragon with us, who's the director of the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, which also is a sponsor of the Chittenden County Homeless Alliance and our coordinated entry program. And sort of for Cameron and perhaps to Paul and Brian, we all know being unhoused and all of the circumstances around it are a regional and state problem, but we're wrestling with it as a municipality. And so I'm sort of just looking for feedback. And in some cases, a real stress the municipality in terms of all of a sudden an obligation that we may need to pay for. That municipalities are not social service organizations. They operate city government. And I mean, CVOEO is a fabulous social service organization. So I guess what I'm sort of struggling with is how much should city government do versus a more strategic approach by the region, the state. And maybe that's sort of an editorial comment, but I guess I'd in Cameron, both because it's you have it as a city and we have it in a big way as a city. And then Paul, as the main provider in our region, if you've got some thoughts on that, I'd appreciate it.
I would love to see this be a larger focus of the state, and that I can say personally. But, you know, as far as the city of Montpelier, I will do what the city council directs me to do. And they're very interested in making sure that people aren't falling through the cracks in Montpelier. And if the state can't pick it up or won't pick it up, you know, it's up to us as municipalities to put more pressure on the state.
Paul, got any thoughts on any of this?
Yeah, hi, thanks, everybody. I mean, first of all, I just want to acknowledge what was said earlier. You know, there are so many systemic barriers in our society, not just in Burlington or Vermont, but the United States in general. And housing and homelessness, it's a huge issue. So none of us want to be here, right, talking about campsites and encampments and doing this. And here we are. I know CVOEO, like all of you, want to see people permanently housed. And unfortunately, we are in an emergent situation. We know homelessness is growing. So we have conversations about shelter pods and encampments and things like this. So I just want to acknowledge that we have a lot of work as a society to do to kind of level the playing field. So that's important to know. None of us want to be in this conversation. Everybody's coming in good faith. I know for CVOEO, we put a lot of effort. It was never something we did a lot of around homelessness, but it has grown to be something that's been very important for us because homelessness has grown so much. So we do have housing advocates, and you know, we have the Community Resource Center. We see 80 to 100 people a day. And we have a really strong street outreach team right now. And we have a new mobile outreach unit that's outfitted to go where people are at. I'm only saying that to say that we can provide support for folks who are out and camping out or living in the street. And we do that. We think that's our obligation and that is our job. And we're happy to kind of do that. I think just generally about this topic, I mean, we would like to go, you know, I think a step further and see safe campsites, safe parking areas, not just in Burlington, but Chittenden County and all around the state, because this is an emergency issue. And I don't see how it benefits anybody morally, ethically, or in their life situation to have people be forced to move from one place to the next who are already living traumatized lives. The folks that we see who can't make it in emergency shelter, many of them just have so many co-occurring mental health and substance use issues, or many are victims of domestic and sexual violence. Some can go into a shelter for a short stay and then they come back out. The state is moving towards what I think is a good thing, which is an occupancy agreement where people can stay more stably in the hotels, which is great. It's not going to serve some people who unfortunately are chronically homeless with a lot of other conditions, who need to be staying, who will be staying outside at times. So again, I mean, I think it is really important that I like this ordinance. I think it's come a long way. I do think the time frame is good because we got to approach people with real compassion and real solutions. If we can't get them housing, then what else are we going to get them? Well, let's try to get you hooked up with other resources. And until we do that successfully, which is our responsibility as a society, then let's make sure that they can stay in the place where they're at, or get them to a comparable place where they can be safe. And you know, a lot of folks at Sears Lane, I know people bash Sears Lane, and I know it was a tough place. We spent a lot of time there. There was something of a community there, and they found protection with each other and a sense of community, and that's important. These aren't just folks going off to live in the woods by themselves. These are folks seeking comfort and connection with other people. So I do think it's important that we really, I'd love the state to go a step further and really create safe parking areas, safe campgrounds, places where we can connect with people that has some resources. And in lieu of this, I think this is a really good step forward because it does approach our collective dignity in a better way.
Paul, has there been any, I mean, Burlington, we're obviously wrestling with this, but have you heard of, and we know Montpelier's approached this, to my knowledge, statewide, the only other community I've heard of with some activity is Brattleboro. What about South Burlington, Essex, Winooski? You know, I mean, certainly we hear from constituents, why does everybody have to come to Burlington?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair statement. And then you could say, why does everybody come to Chittenden County? Why does everybody come to Vermont? We've heard that. And then why do migrants and refugees come to the United States? I think we have to start locally and take our responsibility and urge that this be a statewide issue and a national issue at the same time, but not absolve ourselves for local issues as well. I think that's important, but I do think, Counselor, it's a fair question. We need systemic change, and that is often like a longer term thing. We're in an emergent situation. We know our numbers are going up. Our coordinated entry counts that you cite are going up. We have people waiting who have had a coordinated entry assessment. They're 200 deep right now. They're not going to get housing for quite a while. People are trying. And nobody really wants to, they want to live their life the way they want to live it. And some people will actually just choose to stay in a hotel for 1 or 2 days and then maybe go back out to an encampment, and it's for complicated reasons. So I think we've got every community has to make their own decision, and they've got to make it within their resources and their ability to do things. And we all have to strive for a statewide approach. I'm certain we need to do that, and hopefully a national approach. There are safe campsites, safe parking areas around the country in other states.
Director Pine, do you have any questions you want to bring up at this point?
No, I do think that Paul was getting to sort of the framing that is important to keep in mind, that the tax policy shifts under Ronald Reagan that took massive amounts of tax burden off of the wealthy, and attempted to approach this through a trickle-down economics approach. Also cut funding for Section 8, public housing. Every program that really ensures we have a safety net was essentially decimated. We deinstitutionalized the country without providing adequate funding for community mental health, and a lot of things all came together. So 40 years ago, communities were not sitting around talking about this issue because we actually had systems in place to ensure that folks didn't fall through the cracks. That's way in the past now. So we are where we are now, and I think our challenge as a community, which is really a smaller subset of society, is to find ways to ensure that people have an opportunity to be safe and have their dignity respected. So I think our efforts at the city level are really focused on what tools we have available to do that. And we'll be discussing with the council at the coming meeting on Monday the shelter pod community that we're proposing to create as part of that response. But that's just, these are all like there's no silver bullet, there's silver buckshot. So we need to approach all of these simultaneously.
Thanks. So I think we're moving on time, and I'll get right to you, Morgan. I wanted to have any last questions for the Montpelier folks, and then actually we'll move on to a couple updates from CEDO and our ARP discussion. Morgan, did you have some comment?
Yes, first I wanted to second everything that Paul Dragon had stated. And thank you, Paul. Secondly, oftentimes people focus on, well, the cost of this and the cost of that, and how do we pay for it? And maybe it's the Fed's responsibility, maybe it's the state's, communities need to ante up as well. They have a responsibility, or they should. And one thing I always try to get people to focus on, if you don't address these things, and I think this policy is in part trying to do that, if you don't, there's a cost to not doing anything, both in human terms and financial terms, and not just for the person, but the community. So think about that. Think about how if we stay with the status quo and we don't do anything, who's paying for that? The person, the community, the municipality. So if we go further upstream and we do some of the things that are necessary, maybe that cost won't be so high. Maybe people won't have to pay in terms of their health, and maybe have to die, because that can happen too. If it wasn't for people helping me out when I most needed it, I'd either be still out there or institutionalized or dead. And that's a fact. That's not being dramatic. My heart breaks every time I see people out there and everybody's throwing up their hands. Whoa, we can't do anything and stuff. And we can. We just have to make it a high priority, and we have to exercise the political will. That's what makes the difference. And thank you.
Thank you, Morgan. I note, we had one question from Earhart Monkey. I want to focus primarily on the Montpelier thing, because we want to let those folks, we ask you to continue to participate, but we will have a public forum, so we'll hear from any of the attendees who have comments for us. But if anybody has an additional question for either the Montpelier folks or for Paul, you could raise your hand, and for Cameron, and then we'll move on a little bit.
Well,
Okay.
thank you for the I appreciate coming to speak with y'all. Please reach out if you have any further questions.
Okay, well, we certainly will. We certainly will intend to do that. Thank you all for coming and participating, and I said you're welcome to join us as we move on, and I'm sure we will be talking to you. So thank you. Brian, you were going to give us an update. You sort of started, and I know you're going to be the council, but an update on one of our more immediate initiatives on the shelter pods. So if you could let us know about that. Councilor Hightower, did you also have a
Yeah,
question?
just before that happens, I think it's a little useful to just also for easing folks's things around some of the emails that I've been getting, because you said, we haven't made any decisions yet. I think it's maybe just worth stating that I think it's definitely not my intention, and I don't want to speak for Sarah or Joe, but I don't think it's any of the committees or any counselor's intention. I think we probably, whatever proposal we end up on, I think it will not allow camping in some of the high rec. It won't allow it on baseball fields. It won't allow it on, recreation fields. So that is not part of the, I highly doubt that proposal would pass council. I don't think it's the intention of anyone on this committee. And so even though we haven't made full decisions on that yet, and we're still talking about it, I just want to be clear about we are planning on allowing it or not planning on. I think some of us are hoping to allow it, and some of them less dense areas of city-owned lands, and parks is maybe in the equation just because what encompasses our parks is a pretty wide variety of lands, but it's not necessarily talking about allowing, on Schmanska's field or something like that. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Actually, and maybe I was moving a little too fast, because my intent was, I had said we're not going to make any decisions, but I would like the committee to talk a little bit about timing and process, because while there's a huge amount to unpack in the proposal that we have before us, we may need to do that in pieces. And I had thrown out there that we might wait until we heard from Attorney Richardson, but we should talk about that. And then, I mean, we do as a committee need to talk about how we're going to sort of approach each and all of this. And, you know, what stays on the table, what gets off the table. And Councilor Hightower, I think said it well. Certainly from my personal opinion, I would not be supportive of camping in what I'm going to call urban parks, but I don't know. We haven't defined that. So I think that is one of the pieces that we need an earlier discussion of. We got to sort of sort out how we're going to approach that. And maybe I'll lead to this, not to, we have a meeting coming up on the 21st. We had discussed doing the review of Attorney Richardson's, or repeating Attorney Richardson's proposal. One of the issues is, like all good complicated city government, we need to get feedback from other committees, including the Parks Committee, including Public Safety. And I had tossed out in an email that maybe we ought to have either consider a joint meeting. And then sort of reflecting on that, actually the maybe easiest time to do that might be a work session attached with the April 25th council meeting, which will then have the new councilors on it. And the Attorney Richardson will have finished his work. So I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on, or particularly Councilor McGee and Councilor Hightower, about sort of approaches. Does a work session on April 25th make sense? And then sort of stepping back, what issues on the 21st of April would we like to wrestle with? We don't have to decide that this minute, but I'm tossing that out there because I want the public to understand, you know, how we're going to try to approach this.
Right. And, you know, I think it's, you know, important to note that the ordinance currently doesn't say anywhere in it that camping will just be allowed in parks once this passes. It does allow for the Parks Department to post areas that are prohibited to camping. So those decisions, those conversations are going to have to happen. I think they need to happen before we pass the policy so that we have a good sense of what will need to happen once it goes into effect. I think the Parks Commission, the Parks Department will play a vital role in having that conversation. Councilor-elect Bergman and myself are going to do our best to find a time to present to the Conservation Board as well, and make sure that we're presenting the proposal and then offering time for folks to comment. Unfortunately, their next meeting is organization day, so we might have to wait until the May meeting to have that conversation. But I think I would like to hear from the city attorney is if they're on track to actually finish the review of the proposal by the deadline we set. And if that's the case, then I think a work session. I think I would like to review it in committee at least one more time before we have a work session on it at the full council, to at least sort of set some guardrails for that, so it's a productive conversation. So those are my thoughts right now.
Would I'm just thinking of scheduling. We have a meeting on the 21st, and other than getting the update on the tax policy, which is sort of a whole other issue, we can certainly focus on this issue. Do you think, and it's a little awkward because we haven't reorganized yet, but maybe shooting for a council work session on the 25th makes sense, or at a meeting, should we wait at the meeting after that? I haven't really looked at the schedule to tell you the truth, but and I know public safety, who actually was the original drafter of the original policy, is up to your eyebrows in dealing with the CNA report. So I don't know what thinking you have on timing, and any thoughts? Councilor Hightower, do you have any thoughts on timing of a joint session versus or a work session?
As long as I'm free, I'm happy to do it.
Okay. Well, one of the reasons not knowing what on earth we're going to have on the council agenda for a potential meeting on the 25th, since it will be a new council, it's a little awkward to kind of propose it now. But in the spirit of efficiency, I was thinking, if we want input from public safety and we want input from the Parks Committee and ordinance, we pretty much got most of the council that it ought to be a council work session, because we're covering everybody. And the 25th seemed like a reasonable date.
I
But
do wonder if we can leave public safety out of it, just because of
you were
kind
gonna,
of,
yeah,
the wild schedule that we've had. I know that I don't know if that's, but I don't think that Jane and Karen would mind if we left them off for now and they just had a chance to do this. And I think it's much more important that we talk about this with Parks in addition to the committee. I think just having Cindy here would be great.
and I think that's fine. I think that is my sense as well from Councilor Paul. I think, and that was what was leading me to, though. I think if we had one session, kind of effectively a work session with the council, we could bring everybody, because they're getting lots of questions. And then the detail, like with Parks, makes more sense, or makes more sense. Okay, well, so what I'm sort of sensing, tell me if I'm wrong, we will continue the review on the 21st, and then if possible, we can kind of confirm after the first week in April about maybe a work session on the 25th, attached presumably to a council meeting, which in terms of scheduling, hopefully would work better for folks. Since all the councilors have that night blocked off. And again, not quite understanding what the agenda would be. Well, I'll kind of proceed in that way, and then we'll see what happens after organization day. But and we'll plan on continuing the conversation on the 21st.
Sounds good.
Okay. So Director Pine, can you update us on some of our newest initiatives?
Yeah, sure. You will see in your council packet that went out in the last hour or so that this will be an item on the agenda for this coming Monday council meeting. And the reason why it needs to be on the agenda is because the Public Works Commission authorized the decommissioning of the Elmwood Avenue parking lot, which is a city-owned parking lot at 51 Elmwood Avenue. And it's about 70 parking spaces, which are leased to individuals, a few businesses, lease spaces, and I'll just back up and say that the city went through an internal review process to come up with potential sites for locating shelter pods as part of our response to the homelessness crisis, really, and to be a local municipal response in conjunction with the efforts that are happening by the state of Vermont and the nonprofit housing organizations and the whole cast of stakeholders who are trying to address this issue. The city has stepped up in a way that is pretty unprecedented, both for Burlington and I think certainly for any city in this state, and in many instances perhaps unique for a city our size. And this is something that has the full support of the administration, and we think it will have the full support of the council. But the concept here is essentially to convert the parking lot at 51 Elmwood as a pod community that will serve. There'll be 30 pods, and when I say the word pod, it's really just a word that is intended to describe a sleeping area that is not a housing unit. So people like to call them tiny homes, but I think we don't want to mislead and create a false hope or expectation that this is a home per se. It's really more of a sleeping area. It doesn't have bathroom facilities on its own. It doesn't have a kitchen. And so it's really a bedroom that is built for the purposes of providing emergency shelter. And the bathroom will be provided in a modular unit that is going to contain showers and toilets and facilities. I think there'll be at least 6 stalls that will have those types of facilities, as well as a co-located community resource center, which is similar to and intended to be run much like the existing community resource center, which operates out of the current VFW on South Winsky Avenue. I think the framing for this discussion is always important just to remind folks that the number of people experiencing homelessness has remained about triple what the pre-pandemic levels were. So we're talking about over 700 individuals in this area who are experiencing homelessness, and access to emergency shelters has been curtailed quite a bit during the pandemic. Due to the fact that the contagiousness of the virus led to many congregate facilities being essentially shut down. And so the state's response through the motel voucher program is one part of the response, but that program is slated to wrap up in June. And so our plan has been really an attempt to shoot for a July 1st opening date for the pod community that's planned for 51 Elmwood Avenue. And I'll try and walk through what we are hearing as issues and questions. I see some of them in the chat, but I have to confess, I can't move quickly enough to present and stay on my notes and also read the chat and respond to those. So I'm going to go through the questions that we've been hearing. We're starting to develop a list of frequently asked questions, which we will finish hopefully in a written form and have those available on our website as soon as possible. So we've discussed the location, the reason for this, the co-location. I should just mention that those who park there now will be relocated at the same fee, the same rate that they're paying now, to the city's parking garage next to what used to be Macy's. It's called the Lakeview Garage. So it's immediately adjacent to Burlington High School, is where all of those parkers will be essentially offered spaces at that lot, that city-owned parking garage. And the goal here is to create a place of support, a place of availability of services, and a place of safety, and hopefully some decent, level of decency and dignity for folks. And our goal and our plan right now is for this to be a 3-year endeavor. And then at the end of 3 years, the city will be faced with a decision in conjunction with the community about what to do next. But that's the plan at this point. And the theory there, or sort of the theory of change here, is that there are a number of efforts underway to expand the supply of both permanent affordable housing, permanent supportive housing, a variety of projects, if you will, that are underway using significant ARPA investments from the state and really ramping up the production and conversion of buildings to provide housing that will take place over the coming months and years. And then after a 3-year period, we're hopeful that we will have achieved at least a significant increase in supply that begins to address the need. And I think there's there's a debate there, and it's a reasonable debate about whether that is in fact going to happen over the next 3 years. But that's the theory that we're operating under. So as you all know, the ARPA survey that the city conducted showed that the public's this desire and support for spending significant amount of ARPA funds on addressing homelessness was a top issue, the top issue. And so we are really staying true to that public desire and intention, and the council has continued to be nearly unanimous in its support for this effort. And I think we are hopeful that the council will be unanimously in support of what we're proposing this coming week. The Public Works Commission voted last night by a vote of 4-1 in favor of decommissioning that parking lot. So the council will be asked to essentially approve, as the council is essentially the steward of city property, whether the city property that we're discussing will convert from transition from a parking lot to a place for emergency shelter. The issue of what types of improvements will be made to the site. Obviously, there needs to be adequate infrastructure, so that's water and sanitary sewer services need to be installed, as well as electricity and lighting that's there now will be upgraded to be suitable and appropriate for the use. The units, the pods themselves will all have electricity, and they will have both heating and cooling as part of the plan. Wi-Fi will be available throughout the site. Each pod is really intended to be a single room occupancy type scenario, although there will be a few pods that will be larger in size that could accommodate 2 people. The plan at this point is to have pets allowed, and I'm sure there'll be some criteria around that, but right now the idea is to have pets. The Community Resource Center will provide a low barrier daytime center for access to food and to warm beverages, to hygiene products, opportunity to connect with housing resources, housing navigation services, health resources, including recovery and mental health and other services. People ask, why this lot? Why did you choose this lot over other city lots? And the answer is that the criteria that we used to evaluate which sites were the most appropriate was that the conditions need to be supported in terms of the infrastructure. That's the most critical thing, is the infrastructure needs to be present and easily installed, because construction and the whole process of installing infrastructure can be a significant capital cost, and we wanted to ensure that that could be done in the most cost-effective manner. In addition to utilities and infrastructure needs, we believe it needs to be near bus service and on a bus line, and it's a block from the downtown transit center. In addition, there's local services providers that are right nearby, either in the immediate vicinity or very close by. It's not far from Feeding Chittenden, where many folks get their meals. Salvation Army is often a place where folks get evening meals, and all of this is located within a reasonable proximity. And so rather than a more remote location, there's a lot of benefits to being centrally located, access to service providers and that as well. It's been asked, why not build this facility at Sears Lane? I should note that 2 years ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, the city attempted to do something similar, and funding was not available. At the time, the city had to compete with other projects across the state for a limited amount of funding. There was no recovery funds available at Sears Lane, and so that project never came to fruition. It's also worth noting that the construction of the parkway is slated to begin later this year, perhaps in the summer. The bids are actually due back tomorrow, and depending on the results of the bidding process, the project may actually go into construction. And if it does, you may know this, but the Sears Lane site is very much in the right of way for construction, storage of equipment, storage of conduit and piping, and all of that will be stored throughout various locations. And that is one of the locations where the site is intended to be used for that purpose. So that is part of the decision making was really how are the sites going to be used in the future. I should note just parenthetically that the Elmwood Avenue site was identified by our office over 20 years ago as a good site for affordable housing, and it never came to fruition for a variety of reasons. But that as a surface parking lot, many of us in city government have seen it as a poor use of land to have a surface parking lot in residential mixed-use neighborhood. So that's just one piece I wanted to share. It's been asked what type of shelter this will be. This falls into the category of low barrier, and folks ask what exactly is low barrier. And the basic definition of low barrier is there are limited requirements for entry. There will be some, but it does not require sobriety, for instance. Abstinence is not a criteria for living in a low barrier shelter. There certainly will be expectation for complying with sort of basic code of conduct and standards, and illegal activity will not be allowed. So there will certainly be a level of staffing. By the way, it will be staffed 24 hours a day, 24/7. They'll have security at various hours during the day. Those details have yet to be worked out, but there will be a level of security, and there will be staffing at all times. So that question has been asked multiple times by people about.
Brian, who will the actual managers be? I mean, the city employees, or are you subcontracting that?
We're working out that detail right now, and we're hopeful that we'll have an organization that has experience and is willing to serve that role. We have funding in the budget to pay someone to do that, so that is part of the cost that you all approved when you approved the ARPA allocation. Is the staffing is included in the staffing for the Community Resource Center. I would just add that the budget, the federal budget that recently passed, included an earmark for just under $400,000 to actually subsidize the operation of the Community Resource Center. So that's a really good piece of news for our community, and hopefully we'll lay the groundwork for this to become a service that continues to provide wraparound services and access to again pieces, the essential things that give people a decent modicum of dignity as they try to navigate. And people have asked, what does management of a site mean? I guess an example of management of sites is similar to the way shelters are managed in terms of the coming and the going. There'll be some level of accountability, some level of control as far as people coming and going at different times of the day. The property does have a perimeter fence on 3 sides. There will be another either a replacement fence or an upgraded fence system that will be installed to ensure that there's both security for those living there and to just avoid people kind of coming and cutting through other properties nearby. These issues have come up already as some of the adjacent neighbors have asked, or how are we going to know that people won't be just walking through our backyards? And this needs to function well in a neighborhood. It's not being located on the edge of town for a reason, but it also needs to operate and function in a way that is respectful of the fact that it's part of an urban neighborhood. And so that's really a critical piece of the design and the concept here. It's been asked what's the criteria for people to live in the shelter pod community? And essentially it's the fairly typical prioritization, which is part of the coordinated entry system. So literally homeless is category 1, which is people who are unsheltered. Another category are those staying in a hotel that's not paid for by themselves or their family, including those fleeing domestic or sexual violence. Another top priority category is those staying in a place other than a hotel, including those fleeing domestic or sexual violence. And the last category is a standalone category for those who are fleeing domestic or sexual violence. So those are sort of the priorities. This will be coordinated with other housing resources, with economic services, with 211, it'll be part of coordinated entry. It'll be a pretty, a very managed system, if you will. I would note that Paul Dragon mentioned in his comments that the coordinated entry system has this bottleneck and this backlog, and part of what you all invested in when you invested nearly 3 million of ARPA into the issue of homelessness was augmenting those resources for CBOEO to add staff and to bolster their existing staff to spend all their time on coordinated entry. So we're trying to move at this from many angles, and the shelter pod is just one piece of that. Will folks be able to stay there during the day and lock their pod, or will they have to line up as they do at other shelters? This is not going to function like a typical shelter that way. People who get a shelter, get a pod, will keep the pod, providing that they, just comply with the basic code of conduct, and they will be able to stay in the pod during the day. It's not a site intended to be cleared out in the morning and then reoccupied in the evening. So folks will have that. They'll have a lock to keep their belongings safely. This model has succeeded elsewhere, and people have asked us, are we just moving some of the challenges that we're experiencing at Sears Lane to Elmwood Avenue? And the answer is definitively not. That is not at all what is intended to happen here. As Paul mentioned, and I think others would know, that there was a sense of community that existed at Sears Lane, so it should not be portrayed as necessarily a negative experience for everyone. However, many of the folks who've been rehoused in other housing conditions have certainly appreciated being rehoused during the winter than remaining outside. So this is really intended to be an alternative. I think I've covered everything except the things I forgot that you'll now ask me about, I'm sure.
Thank you, Brian. I want to be mindful of time, and I know Brian's going to be back presenting to the whole council, but do we have any quick questions or comments for him now before he brings it back to us in entirety? Councilor McGee?
Thanks. Brian, could you just briefly go through sort of a plan to engage folks in the neighborhood near and adjacent to the site?
Yeah, that's actually something I should have touched on. It's going to be in your packet material that you're going to see, but I'll just note that we've already had many discussions with individuals, both who are nearby or who have a relationship to the location that's being planned here. In addition to the Public Works Commission discussion last night, there was a meeting with downtown business owners and property owners that occurred on Tuesday of this week. That was convened by the mayor's office, and that went on for 2 hours. It was a very frank and candid conversation. The Ward 2 and 3 NPA will be taking this up at their April meeting, which occurs on April 14th. We've spoken with a property owner that is immediately adjacent to 51 Elmwood Ave, that is the O'Brien family properties, that operates Mackenzie House, which is a large Victorian house that houses individuals and families, as well as a senior housing development that is on that property. And they've agreed and very much would welcome having a meeting occur at Mackenzie House. They have a community room, so it's more conducive to holding a meeting. We're in the planning stages of a neighborhood meeting. We don't have a date. Our location that we hope to be able to book is actually the community space at the Unitarian Church, which is right across Elmwood Avenue, and that we have a date yet to announce on that. In addition, there's been conversations at the Chittenden County Homeless Alliance and all of the stakeholder organizations that work with the homeless folks, and so those experiencing homelessness. And so it's a fast moving process, because we're trying to acknowledge that this is going to take us a lot of effort to get this opened in July, and we're trying to do everything simultaneously. There was a little bit of hesitancy, honestly, to going out and presenting too much before the Public Works Commission gave approval, because it really is, until their approval was granted, it's essentially a city parking lot. And rather than present it as something that was going to happen, we wanted to ensure that we had at least that threshold issue resolved. And by Monday, once we bring it to council, hopefully we'll be able to engage in a much more robust public process.
Just a historical comment, and not to be rude, but people forget quickly. we talked about the Mackenzie site. That was a meat packing plant 50 years ago, right in an urban neighborhood. So, you know, and it was great. Plus, when that whole site got redeveloped for housing, it was much more disturbing to have old John Mackenzie's sausages there every day at the time. Councilor Howtar?
Yeah, thank you so much for all that, Brian. Just a question on, I know that at least in conversation, I feel like a lot of folks, you know, we wanted to spend a fairly significant chunk of the ARPA money on house lists. And, you know, as it got whittled down, it was less and less. And now, you know, it's maybe not as much as we wanted out of the original package, but I think some folks are worried just on the permanence of how much we're spending, like how much of the ARPA money we're spending on like semi-permanent solutions. So I guess I'm just curious in terms of, a lot of this is like kind of investment heavy in terms of, you know, like the pods and in terms of changing the water, sewer, things like that. So I guess I think the original plan that we saw was for 2 or 3 years. So I'm curious as to how long we're planning on this being a site. And I guess I'm saying I hope that it's longer than 2 or 3 years.
It's a really, I think you're asking probably one of the toughest, maybe most poignant questions here, which is how do we balance the urgency today to get people housed and provide at least, in this instance, a shelter option for folks. And it should be viewed in tandem with the efforts to build a permanent supportive housing. It should not be seen as a standalone initiative because it really is, it's part of an overall more comprehensive response. In a few minutes, Todd Rawlings will talk about the home ARP funds, and those funds are going to go into permanent affordable housing that must be connected to services and coordinated entry. And so there's that piece. There's the home ARP, there's city ARPA, but then there's state of Vermont ARPA, which in a much more significant way will be supporting new developments like the former VFW site will become permanent affordable housing. There's other Burlington locations where that will also come forward. We don't have enough definitive information yet, but there'll be other permanent locations. This one is intended to be a 3-year endeavor, hopefully giving time for those other projects to come online. It doesn't mean though that the pods won't serve a ongoing or long-term durable benefit to the community. We're not sure exactly how that will shake out, whether they become, you know, located in other locations, scattered around different places, and, you know, take on a different nature. So I guess there's still details to be worked out as far as what happens after 3 years.
Thanks, Brian. In effort of time, I'm going to say, and I think maybe May meeting, sometime May, June, I really do want to have we regrouped in the fall about what was going on, but we know, I mean, there's several $100 million being allocated by the state for permanent housing. And I think we want to invite back our partners, CHT and the other providers in the May, June timeframe to really update us. Because I think from my perspective, that's where we're going to get the new housing. Our 5 to 15 million isn't gonna put a dent, and I think it's really going to be important for us to fill the gaps, and we really need to understand the bigger picture, which I don't think we're fully getting when we just focus. And Todd will talk about the ARP money, but that's going to be a fairly small piece compared to what the state is going to put in. So we're going to need to update her. If it's okay with folks, unless we've got burning questions for Brian, and I'm sure he'll answer offline. I think I'd like to go into the public forum. It's we're getting closer to 7, and then we need to have the public forum on the ARP home funding, which is a specific requirement of HUD, even though it relates to expenditures, you know, for the house lists. We need Todd to do his specific thing, but Christine, how do we manage public forum here? We don't really have it structured like city council. Do we want to just do a raise hand function? I can call on raised hands or,
Yeah, so I think we'll do a raised hand function, and if you're having trouble with that, just send a note in the chat. I'm
Okay.
not going to promote anyone to panelists because it takes too much time to promote and then change back to attendees. So I'm just going to allow everyone who's raising their hand just to speak. So you
Okay.
will be allowed to talk. Everyone should be allowed to hear you, but you will not show up as panelists. Again, it just takes too much time, and we're running out of time here. So if that's okay with you, Councilor Carpenter,
Sure.
that way.
Yep, and I'll just call on people as I see their hand. And as Christine said, if we miss you, do it in the chat. I see Earhart Monka is raised, and after him, Gail Rafferty and Joe Baird. So Earhart, if you want to start.
Hey, Sarah, thanks. I actually had a question earlier when the folks from Montpelier were still there, though it wasn't directly to them. The question had to do with, and I know this is private property, but what occurred to me was, as they were describing Hubbard Park and the other parks in Montpelier, and we have really large amounts of, relatively large for our, for Burlington, amounts of forested land, but it's in private property. There's Centennial Woods, there's the Episcopal Diocese lands, there's Winooski Valley Parks District owns a fair amount of land. I guess just a broad question. I'm wondering if any outreach has been done to those owners and by the city, and whether or not we know anything about their policies around whether or not they're allowing individuals or small groups of individuals to camp on their property. So just a question. I don't need an answer back unless there is one, but it's just something I guess I would encourage folks who are looking into this policy to do some outreach on. And then the other thing, just for Brian, Brian, you said that the State's Motel program is ending at the end of June. It is my understanding is that they're using some of the federal funds that come through the VRAP, the Vermont Emergency Rental Assistance Program, to basically allow folks to stay in motels on a longer term basis, on a 3-month and on an every 3-month lease basis. So if and I applaud the city's efforts on the pod community. But if, motel voucher stays in effect will still be here beyond July 1 as one of the many solutions for transitioning folks into longer range housing. Thank you. That's it for me.
I'll move on. Just one comment. I think it will be important to look at that. People perceive some of those areas you mentioned as city-owned that are not. I mean, Centennial Woods is a big one, and much of the Episcopal Diocese land is a big one. So all three of those in the Winooski Park District. So that needs to be put in the hopper, but it's not city land. So that's all something you're right, we need to look at. Gail, the next person I see is Gail Rafferty. Gail, there we go.
I just unmuted. Thank you to all of you. This has been super informative. And I know, Brian, you're offline, but thank you for running through the pod community. That was super helpful as well. I have a question regarding the proposed ordinance. And I was heartened to hear all three of you say that you really don't see the urban parks with features and facilities especially for children's recreation, as being ideal for allowing camping, which is great. But my question is, for people who might break that rule, even if those parks are well posted and it says camping is prohibited, we have certainly seen violations of that under the current policy where camping is prohibited. And if I just have to go back to the 30 days, if an individual or several individuals are given 30 days to move on or to accept an alternative or choose an alternative, functionally, that's going to allow for a lot of sequential camping, perhaps in a dense urban park. We speak with experience. Smalley Park was inhabited most of last summer. Children's recreation ground to a halt. there were a lot of negative consequences for the neighborhood, and the park ceased to function as it was intended. So I just got to ask why 30 days and how that factors in, because it's simple to say, oh, no, there won't be park camping in those parks. And I really appreciate that you came out and said that. But functionally, the enforcement doesn't match that statement, I guess, is what I want to say. I think I
Thanks.
direct this perhaps to Councillor McGee, who has much more knowledge of why that got written, and I don't know if Councillor-elect Bergman is still present.
In the interest of time, Gail, I'll try to connect with you offline. If you're able to send me an email, I'd be happy to touch base on the phone, and I'll certainly be posting more clarification publicly as these questions come out.
Thank you. And I would say from my perspective, again, I've repeatedly said there's a lot to unpack, and I think that one in particular will and should have a lot of conversation around it. I think when this committee gets more focus, at some level, we're going to have to start going through things almost line by line, but I don't think we're there yet. I think we've got to work through educating ourselves and come to some bigger concept decisions first, is my opinion. Joel, I see you as next. Joel Baird.
Mute. All right, I am unmuted now. Yeah, hi. I'm also grateful for the detail that you all are willing to go into here, and a lot of interesting perspective from Montpelier. Foremost, I guess, was the type of parks that they have, as opposed to the kind of parks that Burlington mostly has. And so my suggestion, I guess, would be to ask, well, let me ask this as a question. Is the change to the current ordinance really necessary when it sounds like a prohibition to camping in city parks is really going to be the exception rather than the rule? It sounds like most Burlington city parks are not going to be, camping will not be permitted in. So, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like city parks, as most people understand them, are going to be off bounds. And therefore, a lifting of the prohibition on camping is going to say, okay, now, well, camping is allowed, but it's prohibited in most of the places. So I think I would recommend you all look at the possibility of saying, okay, well, keep the prohibition in place, because I think that is best understood by people who might be considering camping, either in Chittenden County or beyond. If Burlington says, hey, camping is legal in city parks, which it would be, at least on paper, we're bound to attract visitors that we can barely support, I think. And however much we want to, I don't think we can afford to support folks who might be attracted to a really only partially informed notion of what our policy is. So if we keep the prohibition in place, I think it's pretty straightforward. Yeah, you can't camp in a city park. They're not designed for that. And outreach is going to be tricky, and enforcement's going to be tricky. However, if we say, here's where people can camp, you don't mess with the city parks ordinance. I think we've heard a lot of interesting options here, and the most recent one is that Earhart mentioned, outreach to the Winooski Park system. what would happen if a lot of us want to help somehow, and I think you all are tapping into that. We do feel kind of helpless or stymied by lack of money. Maybe we should, you know how you have hosts, and Earhart didn't say this, but reaching out to private citizens who have huge backyards, who have ample space or camps, and say, look, folks, could you adopt a camper? For how many campers could you reasonably and safely accommodate? I don't know, and maybe this is a real harebrained idea. I've had several in my time per day, but and there might be liability issues, there might be all sorts of insurance issues, but it would tap into, I think, a feeling of civil participation and get people involved in ways that they can help directly. But again, I'm willing to concede that's a harebrained idea. But my first idea is that I don't think is quite as harebrained, and I hope you all consider it. That is, keep the ordinance, keep the prohibition in place, but make it clear that there are places to park, just not, places to camp. And you cannot build a shack in a city park. You cannot bring an RV in a city park. And you can't bring a tent into a city park and sleep. But there are some places where you can. And I think that would be the honest way of going about it. So thank you all so much. If you have any comments, particularly about the harebrained idea, let me know. And we'll be in touch. Thanks.
Thank you, Joel. We are closing in on time here. Do we have any more public comments before we move in to the public hearing for the ARP home money? Okay, I see Sam Powers and Stephen Marshall. Sam?
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of respond to the previous person in saying I understand this policy is not necessarily to provide a bunch of public space for people to camp necessarily. That's, you know, as you guys have said multiple times during this meeting, you're deciding, you're working on deciding what places are campable and prohibited. But it seems like this proposal, and from what I've read, is really providing due process for houseless people and a process for the city to follow to kind of a formal process rather than the what seems like a very punitive and informal process that's currently followed in regards to homeless people camping on our city land. Next, I would also like to just respond to what Councilwoman Carpenter said about like kind of state, regional, or national support. I agree that there should be more of that in regards to houseless people, but I don't think we should let the absence of state, regional, or national support be an excuse for our inaction now. And finally, people have said in this forum, as well as like Front Porch Forum, you know, why is everyone coming to Burlington? I think it's because we actually are compassionate in our laws. Our laws are not as punitive as much of the rest of the United States. And I think the logical conclusion to that rhetorical question as posed is to be less compassionate. And I think many of us believe that that's unacceptable. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam. Stephen? Are you there? There we go.
You can hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah. So a couple of points. The gentleman before the last gentleman, I'm in sympathy with what he had to say. The gentleman before that made a point about private people asking, volunteering. And the simple answer to that question is they can do that now. And there are lots of instances that I've heard of in my time here in Burlington where houseless people were allowed to camp on private property with the agreement of the property owner. The one thing that this policy might do is consider how it would address social service needs of people who are living on private property. The other point, I think the significant point is that you're going to have people who do not abide by the rules. And the question is, how do you work with them and bring them into the embrace of a legal framework so that it's not a crime, obviously, but we're talking about harm reduction. So that's why the proposal that I've made many, many times, in which I alluded to further up in the chat, is the idea that you accept that people are going to be camping, and then you simply find out who they are, where they are, and make acknowledgement that that's where they are, and that if there's trouble, if they're having trouble with somebody, they can call the police, and the police will respond, and there will be public support for them. And then if they are causing trouble, we know where they are, and they can be arrested if they've committed a crime or whatever. But the idea is, you're not saying strictly, yes, you can camp anywhere. You're saying, we know you're going to be camping, so let's just find out where you're camping. And I don't know if this proposal accommodates that idea. I haven't had an opportunity to read it, but I trust that my idea, you've heard my idea.
Thanks, Steve. Again, we need to move on, but I will say that one of our expectations of the legal review by the city attorney is we'll look at some of those issues, as well as the sort of big picture of the so-called Boise decision, which is what happens around people's emergency needs to camp versus affirmative camping. There are two different proposals. So that is in fact something we've got to wrestle with. I'll take like one more public comment. We're always open to any written comment, and as we get that, we'll include it with the minutes. And I'm just gonna keep repeating this. I see multiple other meetings, so this is not intended in any fashion to be the last meeting. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. I think further down the line, when we, I don't want to say narrow, but walk through what we're going to propose, we're going to need, a sort of specific hearing on that. We're really from my opinion, in an information sort of gathering mode. So I just want to make sure we're all clear on that. I also want to note that we haven't, I talked about workshop sessions with the council, and I think council agrees. We really haven't focused conversations a lot with staff. I notice one of our lead workers on this issue is Lacey Ann Smith from Public Safety Department. I mean, there are folks in the Parks Department. So there's a whole set of work sessions that's still going to happen. So I think with that, if it's okay, we'll close the public comments period and move on to the formal public hearing for the ARP home funding. And we have Todd Rawlings with us from the CEDU office, who will explain that to us and make a presentation on that. And then we'll take any comments around the use of that funding.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, all. Again, I'm Todd Rawlings. I'm the Housing Program Manager here at the Community and Economic Development Office. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen. All right. All right, can you all see what looks to be a PowerPoint presentation? Okay, great. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm here today to do the public hearing for the Home Investment Partnerships American Rescue Plan funding that the city will be receiving, or as we call it, Home ARP. And as some of you may remember, in February, I gave an overview of our outreach efforts and progress related to the Home ARP process. At that time, we hadn't yet completed our draft plan. Since then, we have published the draft plan as of March 2nd. So again, briefly, an overview of Home ARP. This is $1.5 million of federal funding, which is to be used expressly to assist folks who are currently experiencing homelessness or are at risk of homelessness. It is intended to be, as you know, picking up on what Brian said, one of many different tools that we can use to address the emergency that Burlington and Chittenden County and Vermont and the whole country is experiencing. The funds must be spent by 2030, so we have a little bit of flexibility in terms of how we can spend that money. They need to be used for the development of rental housing and or non-congregate shelter services, and for essentially support for our nonprofit partners who are undertaking those activities. We have conducted quite an extensive outreach effort, paying particular focus to our partners in the continuum of care, which is our nonprofits who focus on helping folks who are homeless within Chittenden County. And after I think 19 or 20 individual meetings with those folks, polling them about what they understood to be the greatest need and opportunity for this funding, with the recognition that $1.5 million is you know, it's certainly not going to solve the problem of homelessness in Burlington, much less Chittenden County. But within that sort of scarcity, we asked them essentially to tell us how they thought we should allocate this funding. What we heard overwhelmingly was that our partners thought that investing the vast majority of these funds in permanent, affordable rental housing was the best use of those funds. As I mentioned, the plan that I'm going to give an overview of in the following slides was released for public comment on March 2nd, and today we're here to gather feedback on that plan. Okay, so in terms of specifically what the plan proposes in terms of funding, you can see that of non-congregate shelter, rental housing, tenant-based rental assistance and supportive services, we are choosing to prioritize the development of affordable housing, with all of these funds less funds which go to supporting our nonprofit partners to undertake these activities, and administration of the program, which involves not only the preparation of the plan but annual monitoring for the performance, as with any federal grant. This plan is based on two key assumptions we just wanted to call out, which is that this assumes that the city will be designated some of its ARPA funding for some of these other activities. And importantly, that the motel program will continue at least over the medium term. And in addition to this, that the services, that there will be service provision to folks who are housed in permanent housing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So if any of these turn out to be incorrect, we reserve the right to revisit this plan and change the allocation if that's possible at that time. Plan highlights, I mentioned our outreach efforts with our partners. Part of the plan requirement from HUD is that there's a gap analysis. Certainly, Brian mentioned that the almost threefold increase in terms of the number of homeless folks in Chittenden County between 2020 and 21. Our analysis also pointed to essentially census data, which suggested that there's a gap of over 2,700 units for households under 50% of median income. And what that means is that, again, according to census data, there are this many households who are rent burdened in Burlington below 50% of the median income. In terms of the proposed uses, I just shared that chart with you. It's a necessary part of the plan. The allocation method and criteria, I will touch on that a little bit later because it relates to some of the comments. But one of the things that we heard from our outreach was a lot of discussion about the three-legged stool of housing, services, and vouchers, that these were all necessary in order to ensure that folks who are coming out of homelessness are successful in keeping permanent housing over the long term. So our evaluation criteria for this funding, as we decide how we make awards to specific projects, will be to ensure that projects are set up for success. In other words, there's a plan around services, there's a plan around vouchers, and we've tried to provide some flexibility with respect to what those plans are, but it's a necessary part. We don't want to be funding projects where folks are not going to be supportive or they're not going to be able to afford their apartment. We don't want to ultimately do more harm than good. So in terms of preferences, one of the proposed changes to the draft plan that we have is that is including or making explicit really the requirement to use coordinated entry. It's actually a requirement of the regulation that for home ARP projects, the tenants need to be selected using the coordinated entry system or a project-specific wait list. So certainly we're going to be heavily favoring in our scoring folks who have demonstrated a commitment to coordinated entry. And we're also required to articulate production goals, and which is always kind of a tricky thing when you're talking about something like this, because with an award this size, we're usually, when we make home awards, we're usually a fraction of the overall total development cost. We'd like to believe that we're a critical part of that and necessary piece of the puzzle. So our estimate based on what the Vermont Housing Conservation Board's projections were is that this will ultimately leverage the production of 25 new permanently affordable units for folks coming out of homelessness. We had a bunch of great comments already after publishing our plan. Really two main categories of comments. The first relates to requiring applicants for home ARP funds to make a presentation to the CCHA, and apologies for the acronyms here, but that's, as you probably know, the Chittenden County Homeless Alliance, or the local continuum of care. And so we're going to require that developers of affordable housing bring these projects to the continuum of care and essentially present a comprehensive plan for how is this going to be a successful project. One piece of that is to make clear whether or not the project will use coordinated entry, and if not, what other method of tenant selection is required. And part of the intent here is to, as I mentioned, there's a lot of different funding sources in these projects. And one of the main sources is state ARPA funding, as I think Brian or Sarah mentioned. And we want to make sure that our funding criteria are compatible with the Vermont Housing Conservation Board's funding criteria. So we're grateful for the comments that we've received to help blend those criteria. Again, making just crystal clear what who's eligible for this. Must be leased to folks who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, per the essentially the regulation, and then adding the new criteria, which really heavily weights projects which use coordinated entry explicitly and not the project specific wait list. We have received one written comment, which is not reflected in these proposed plan updates, and we are still reviewing it and have yet to determine whether or not it will trigger any changes to the plan. So in terms of the timeline, as I mentioned, March 2nd, we started the process, the plan process today, of course, the public hearing. April 1st is the last day that we'll be accepting public comments on the plan. On April 11th, we are hoping to go to the Board of Finance and City Council for approval of the plan. And following that approval, if we receive it, we'll submit the plan to HUD. And we are hoping that by the end of May, we receive HUD approval for that. Following HUD approval, then we can issue a request for proposals for specific projects that we can fund. A couple of additional points here. One of the things that I'd like to request is that that the CDNR sponsors the resolution that we will ultimately bring to City Council for approving this plan. Actually, I think that was my main point on that. So, and then we're happy to accept public comments, of course, during this meeting, and happy to say that it's being recorded so we can be sure to get those just right. And then please email me, call me, write me, message in a bottle, whatever works best for you. And I'll put this contact information in the chat so that we don't need to leave the slide up continuously. But for those of you who want to write it down, here, once again, is my contact information. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd. Do we have any attendees at this point who want to comment directly? I had thought Rachel Battison said she was coming back, but I don't see her on the list. Are there any other attendees who have comments specifically related to this? Earhart, I still see your hand up. Do you have a comment on this, or are you just not taking your hand down?
Sorry, I'll get it down.
Okay,
Just had moved on to other things.
okay. Todd, I had a question related to the coordinated entry, which I think is a good requirement, and project specific. Can you do both? For example, if you had and I think when I connote project specific, that would be veterans or domestic violence. Can you have a target population and still work off coordinated entry?
You know, that's a good question. And I might ask my colleague, Marcella Gange, if she's still on this call to answer that. I don't know. What I can tell you is that related to the subject of preferences, which I think I may have skipped over that bullet point, the home ARP regulation requires that we determine whether or not we are going to be making preferences for any sort of subgroup of folks who are homeless. What we heard in our outreach was that we did have some folks who expressed some opinion on that. We heard some folks say that, you know, certainly that recovery housing is needed, that folks experiencing mental health issues certainly needed, substance use issues, but we didn't get a clear consensus in terms of many folks telling us that there was one group. In addition, we also heard about domestic violence survivors as well. So I don't know how preferences and coordinated entry blend. And Sarah, do you see Marcella still here?
Yeah, I do, and she's on there, so we'll
Okay, great.
ask her to answer. And my question was more, I mean, it's all, with every housing, it's all about opportunity. And sometimes there's an opportunity to provide a housing, option for a certain group of folks. It just rises to the top of, there's a piece of property, there's a sponsor group, and you would hate to disallow them. On the other hand, coordinated entry has been working well and is important. So I'm just sort of curious. So, Marcella, do you have a thought on?
Sorry, Marcella, I just wanted to reach out to that, and I think that's why we certainly heard some folks say you've got to use coordinated entry, or you don't get funded with this funding. You don't get the home ARP funding, and I think we try to approach this with a certain amount of humility in that we don't know the circumstances of every single project or every single sort of targeted group which could benefit from home ARP funding. And so we wanted to essentially give a waiver if it were justified for not using coordinated entry. And so so that said, I guess I'll let Marcella take the rest of that question.
I'm embarrassed to say I only caught half of the question. I think it was, do we have prioritizations within coordinated entry? Is that the essence of the question?
Well, what I heard Todd say was all the projects have to use coordinated entry. And my question was sort of a subgroup. And I see a comment from CVOEO on that. Yes, I mean, as I understand coordinated entry, it's sort of a wait list. You've identified a chronically homeless family or person. You get them involved in the project and you support them in finding permanent housing. But
yeah, so
on the coordinated entry list, so to speak, you could have certain groups of people who might benefit from a housing opportunity of like supported people, like
certainly,
or mental health or veterans. And I'm just sort of, can you do both? I guess my question.
Yes.
And I see a comment from Sarah Russell, so maybe she could speak as well.
So within coordinated entry, there are the system of coordinated entry also kind of there's a vulnerability scoring within it, and those would be different factors of vulnerability, which is where the prioritizations come from. The CCHA has we're prioritizing within the CCHA chronically homeless and veterans, and I think Sarah had said that families as well. And as she says there as well, we've also in the past, most recently actually, when we brought online one of the recent CHT projects, there was a new policy brought in to adjust the prioritization for that housing placement, and that was so that the project itself could be better managed to look at who was coming into it, so that the project wasn't overwhelmed with folks with particular needs, and so that there could be a balance within the project. So that was an example of how within coordinated entry those prioritizations were changed to allow the project to be successful.
Councilor Hightower, did you have a question, or were you just raising your hand? Okay. Sarah Russell, did you have any further comment on that?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. I wanted to back up what Marcella said. We do have within our current coordinated entry policy and procedures the ability to adjust prioritization based on the particular housing development or housing unit that is available. And as Marcella said, we have done that in the past. And I want to stress that goodness of fit is everything when we think about moving folks from homelessness into housing, and that we have a clear prioritization from the most vulnerable to the least vulnerable, a master list that we use, and that's adjusted based on where the specific unit is or the units are. So the Community Housing Review Committee, which is a subcommittee of coordinated entry within the Chittenden County Homeless Alliance, makes referrals to housing units and for housing placement, not only based on vulnerability and the sub populations that we've listed, such as HUD definition of chronic, veterans, and families, but also based on the particular housing opportunity that is available. Therefore, I would say that providing a waiver would not be necessary because embedded within our current coordinated entry policies, we have the ability to reprioritize based on the housing development. So, I mean, I would pretty strongly advocate that we not, veer from current coordinated entry policy. And I'm not seeing that a waiver is necessary in this situation.
Okay, do we have any other comments on this? Todd, I had one more. You in your presentation, you had listed where you'd gotten some feedback, and then you had one sort of open-ended that you were considering an additional feedback. Is that something philosophically we should know about, or I mean, how does that get into your consideration?
Do you mean that that feedback, that there was one comment that we had received that we
yes
yes, we did receive a comment from Cathedral Square related to essentially not let me see if I can actually find it. Yeah, so that they asked us to, in our underwriting criteria, not require proof of funding for housing retention services. Essentially, what we had, one of the things that we discovered in our conversations with some nonprofits is that there's a services sinking fund that's built into the development budget. Essentially, they're capitalizing a substantial amount of funding in the project to ensure that services are provided to the folks that are living in those units. And our current criteria requires that either there's some sort of demonstration that that services will occur for the 15-year home ARP performance period, or that either through some sort of, I think what we're thinking at this point is some sort of memorandum of understanding, or actually capitalizing some funding at the beginning. So we're still thinking about whether or not that's what we think is the best solution there. So.
Good. Other questions for Todd or comments? Okay. We're past our time. Other business we need to bring up. I think we can do this offline if we need to adjust some clarity around agenda for the next meeting on the 21st. We have one topic sort of separate we need to deal with, and then relative to this topic, we ought to, maybe all three of us can think about timing and getting additional feedback and kind of how we ought to work that out. We obviously want as much feedback as we can get. So I guess I'd ask us to ponder that. We can talk about it now, or we can try to, lay out, or I can throw out a few thoughts and maybe you all could react to that. Joe, do you have any thoughts on that?
I was just going to say I'm running about 6 minutes late to another meeting. So I will mull over the timeline and some guardrails for continuing the conversation and getting that feedback in. I think a lot of folks have been reaching out to me, whether it's on other boards and commissions or departments, to find time to talk about it. So I'm trying to pull all that together and put it together in a packet for whatever the next phase looks like for us.
Okay, I think that'd be helpful. Okay, we'll work on that, and if there's no other feedback, I would take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Okay. Thank you all.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.